Recovery. I'm April Davis here along with the clinical director of Sophros Recovery, Erin Moran, as well as the therapist, Ivey, and she's joining us for the first time, so I definitely want to introduce both of them today. Jackie is from Baltimore, Maryland, and she's now a full-time Florida resident. She got her master's from Johns Hopkins in clinical mental health counseling and began her clinical work as an eating disorder therapist, and then she moved here in 2021. And she is loving her life at Sophros Recovery, utilizing a diverse range of modalities to reach each individual client's needs. We always talk about that, making sure that we are specific to each client at Sophros. And Jackie makes sure that she has a holistic framework to integrate spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional facets of well-being, and helps aid growth and assist individuals in developing a deeper understanding of yourself and your needs. And outside work, Jackie likes to go to the beach. We were just talking about that. We love the beach, exercising, and travel. So welcome, Jackie.
Thank you so much.
We're happy to have you. And Erin is joining us once again. She's a licensed mental health counselor and certified group practitioner. She is the clinical director over at Sophros. She has her master's as well in clinical mental health counseling from UNF. And she began her career as a therapist working at the University of North Florida Counseling Center. This is my Carolina coming into the mix here. UNF Counseling Center, so we love that you have that local connection. And she had a private practice at one point, and she's been fortunate to work with people from diverse backgrounds. So she's worked with all kinds of addiction, trauma, anxiety, depression, identity conflicts, histories of abuse, and relationship and family stress. So she knows it all, and she has a therapy style incorporating client-centered interpersonal work, emotion-focused and psychodynamic approaches, and believes in treating the whole person. And she likes to have a life outside of work as well. She loves her dog and cat. She does yoga from time to time and watches those Marvel shows and movies, and get to the mountains when you can.
Absolutely.
So we got both ends of the spectrum covered. We love the beach, we love the mountains, and we love having you here with us this afternoon as we talk about some really cool things, as we always do when it comes to addiction and recovery. Today we're going to talk about boundaries and codependency. So sometimes we talk about codependency, and I think sometimes it's hard to grasp, okay, what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean you're just necessarily latching on to someone. We can talk in more in depth about it. And so let's start with that. What is codependency, Erin?
Yeah, I think codependency, a lot of these therapy words, as we're hearing week after week, are becoming a lot of these buzzwords. And so as people are like, oh, you're so codependent, and it's like, well, what does it actually mean? And it is a deeper pattern. So someone who struggles with codependency, this is a deep relational pattern. It impacts your relationship with yourself. In a lot of ways, it means you've been disconnected from your own internal needs, and then also impacts your relationship with other people. So oftentimes when someone does have a tendency towards codependency, there's a lot of, unfortunately, like self-destructive and painful behaviors, because we are doing a lot of avoidance behaviors, where there's a lot of low self-esteem, a lot of anxieties, and we're trying often to keep the peace at the cost of sometimes truth, or the cost of openness and honesty. And so when we say self-destruction, that can cause us to not be in alignment with ourselves.
I also think a big piece too is kind of this feeling of worthiness, of worth, and placing so much worth and need, within someone or something outside of yourself. And then you begin to, as Erin mentioned, lose parts of yourself and lose parts of your identity, maybe even, or your ability to effectively really know what are you really needing and how that plays out. And so I think that another big piece of codependency is just that external feeling and wanting of being needed or wanting to be seen by something that is outside of you.
And so does that mean, like a good example would be great, because I'm curious, does that mean, okay, does that just mean you take care of your husband and your kids more than you take care of yourself? Does that mean that you're truly identifying as a caretaker instead of saying, oh, let me think more about my own identity? Like, so first of all, could it just be a relationship type thing?
Yeah.
As far as your kids and your husband, and then you say, that's who I am. I'm a mom.
Right. So I think relationally, it's about balance, right? So it's about finding the appropriate balance between what is it that my partner or my children needs, and then what is it that I'm needing within that as well. So I think in codependency, sometimes the focus can be so much on the needs or what the other person is doing, or maybe not doing, but needing outside of what my needs are. So
it's a little bit of loss of self is what it is, and that caretaking, you know, instantly I think of my mom is an amazing caretaker. She is a teacher, so she's amazing with children. She is an amazing mom. She's a phenomenal grandmother. She loves, you know, cooking meals for us. She loves to be able to show up for us. Like, she is through and through a caretaker. That, there's nothing innately wrong with that. That's a beautiful thing. It's when that goes to a point of, if she is exhausted, if she needs some quiet time, if she needs, you know, to take care of herself, you know, and instead she's saying, oh, I don't want to inconvenience you, or I don't want to burden you, or I don't want you to be disappointed or mad. That is when it is sacrificial, not a compromise, but it's saying her needs come last. Or she's maybe, if she isn't in touch with even, oh, I want to be there, but I maybe don't have that ability right now. I don't have that energy. I don't have that the access to money right now. It's when our needs, or the individual's needs, get turned off.
Yeah.
So you can be a caretaker, and that's what we're going to get into a little later in this talk, is sort of what boundaries. Codependency exists without very clearly defined boundaries. I'm caretaking at the cost of myself, and my needs come last, or sometimes don't come at all. My identity, my self-worth, my feeling of okayness and value lies in the ability to do for others.
Yeah, I like what you said about compromise, because if you're compromising, then that, you know, that kind of rules out codependency, right?
Yeah, and another quick thing that I wanted to touch on is, I use this analogy a lot in therapy, and I talk about circles, and I talk about viewing relationships as circles. So sometimes in codependency, if you were to think of your relationship, you as one circle, your partner as another circle, codependency can kind of look like those two circles becoming one bigger circle, and kind of like this part of again, like losing parts of yourself within that relationship. And the way I like to frame it is, okay, we're going to take your circle and we're going to take your partner's circle, and we're creating a third circle. So it's not the two circles necessarily becoming one, it's the two circles creating a third. And so there's overlap within that third circle that is created. So that may mean we share similar values, we share similar interests, we share similar beliefs towards things or outlooks on things. We also, though, nurture and unconditionally support one another's individual circles. So say, for example, I am somebody within a relationship that values and needs alone time, right? And say my partner, or, you know, whoever I'm with, even a friend, you know, this doesn't have to necessarily only play out in terms of romantic relationships and partnerships. This can be family, friends, whomever. Say the other person doesn't need that as much. It would be the hopes that that counterpart is able to acknowledge and support the fact that I do need that. And if I'm getting support within that, then the likelihood of that dissipating or that dissolving is going to be minimal, right? Not as risky. Whereas if my partner has, or whoever it is, has a reaction to that and feels a certain type of way, it's not avoiding that conversation. It's coming together and talking about, what about that makes you feel upset? Or what about you, like, how do you feel when I take alone time to myself? And again, it's engaging in some level of compromise while still nurturing that is something that you're needing while in a relationship in whatever relationship that is, right? A friendship, a partnership, a family membership, whatever it is.
Caretaker does not equal codependency.
Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. And so let me give a number real quick, because I know that this is a hot topic. There are lots of books out about codependency, and you do read some of those things, and then you think, wait, do I have an issue? So they can answer your questions without having to read 10 books and let you know if there's something that is related to addiction, or perhaps you're ready for recovery. And you can call Soft Roast Recovery at 904-439-4805. Again, 904-439-4805 for Soft Roast Recovery in Jacksonville. We define codependency, and we're also talking about boundaries today. So what are boundaries? When someone says it's important to have boundaries in relationships, what exactly does that mean? Erin?
Yeah, so we'll probably be continuing this one for a bit, because there are different types of boundaries. And that also is a very confusing concept, because especially for people who maybe do struggle with codependency, boundaries can feel really harsh, critical, like a judgment. But what are they? They can be material things. So this is choosing what I lend or borrow from someone, choosing, saying something is, if my stuff is important to me, being like, no, like you can't go through my purse, that would be a boundary. It could be physical. So that is, the space that I'm comfortable with, or the space I'm occupying. That could be the right to privacy. That could be the right to my body. Maybe physical is, some people are super comfortable giving hugs or receiving hugs. Some people that is not in their comfort. That's a physical boundary. There can be kind of like the mental / emotional ones. These are our thoughts. These are our beliefs and our values. So, for example, if someone becomes highly argumentative or defensive, maybe you have kind of a little bit more weaker or fluid emotional boundaries. If you have the ability to accept responsibility without blame, without excessive guilt or anything like that, then maybe you have really healthy and clear mental and emotional boundaries. So there's such a variation of what they look like, but it comes down to having human rights, having basic rights of, one thing I always say to people is sometimes no is a boundary.
That's a good one. That's a good boundary. We got lots more to talk about when it comes to boundaries. I will let Jackie in on the conversation here after the break. I just want to give the phone number out one quick time before we go to break. For Soft Roast Recovery here in Jacksonville, that number is 904-439-4805. Welcome back to Healing Your Life with Soft Roast Recovery here on this Sunday afternoon. And we have Jackie Ivey, a therapist at Soft Roast Recovery, along with the clinical director, Erin Moran. And we're talking about boundaries and codependency. And we talked a lot about some physical type boundaries. And we wanted to hit on the fact that boundaries are for a person's well-being. They aren't meant to punish, right, Jackie?
Right. So boundaries are parameters. And parameters of what I am willing or not willing to receive. So boundaries can look, I kind of like to differentiate between what's a boundary and what's a wall. Because when boundaries are super, super rigid, it's almost like thinking of concrete blocks or something. So there's no willingness to be flexible within them. Where porous boundaries, right, are a little bit more and way too flexible. So it's maybe saying yes way more than you're really wanting to, or kind of being like the yes mammer versus saying no, right? And so I think that having healthy boundaries is having there be flexibility, and also acknowledging the fact that it is okay to say no, and it is okay to set a boundary of I don't feel comfortable with X thing. And then having a conversation and really expressing like, well, what would feel better for you?
Yeah.
What it comes down to is boundaries are for trust, safety, and clarity for every individual who's involved. If that's just two people, great. If it's a family, great. If it's a friend group, great. It's it's sort of, if we're imagining, animals, it's a fence. It's not a, like Jackie said, it's not a concrete thick wall that you can't see. There's no breeze, there's no movement. You don't even know what's behind it. You're left being like, what is happening? Like, I know I hear something over there, but I can't see it. I can't smell it. But it's also not a bunch of strings. It's like if there's a busy road and I'm trying to keep my animals in, if I'm having a giant gaps in between it, they're like, what is this? This is a joke. This isn't a thing. That's porous. That's where it's not actually creating safety, but I imagine it to be a really solid but clear, you can see the fence. I can see the other side. We can talk about the other side. I can understand what's happening over there, but this boundary is here because it's keeping the one person safe, or it's keeping the other person safe.
Or the relationship safe.
Because we all have different needs. And even if we go back to the hugging component, not all boundaries are meant to be, harsh and cruel. But if I have either trauma or I have anxiety, or it's just not a culture that I'm growing up with being touched by people, doing that, if I have trauma, can create a reaction. And then we're both going to be like, I'm going to not feel good. And Jackie's going to be like, what the heck just happened?
Yeah.
Versus if we ask, and that's what a boundary is, just being like, hey, would you like a hug? Or is that something you're comfortable with? Checking in on it. I can express where I'm at, and she can understand that, vice versa.
And how do you express that appropriately? Because I know that we were talking about, okay, they can be more effective if you're very clear, right?
Yeah, so I always err on the side of receiving and checking in before doing.
Yeah.
So consent, not only physical. So do you feel comfortable if I give you a hug right now, or if I see somebody's hair that really inspires me and I have an inkling to want to touch it? I don't know, that's kind of a weird analogy maybe, but
oh no,
asking,
we as
like,
women understand that.
Is it comfortable, like if I touch your hair really quickly, or
right.
And you can check in. It's the same with emotional boundaries as well. So say I've had a super long day at work, and shout out to my sister, we are incredible at doing this with each other, and I really appreciate that within our relationship. We check in before the conversation starts, like, hey, I'm having a really hard day at work and I'm needing some space, and I just need to vent, and I need somebody to listen. Is this an okay time for you? Are you busy right now? Have you had a long day? Like, you're kind of doing a temperature check of capacity and what you're able to really give to that other person within that moment. So that's an example of more of an emotional, or maybe even like communication type boundary, in which you can check in before I just pick up the phone and call her and I'm like, oh my gosh, I ran into so much traffic and blah, blah, blah. And then I'm kind of just like dumping all my stuff onto her without really knowing if she has that space to hold for me.
And kudos to your sister for real, because that is just courteous. And I do that as a habit as well.
Yeah.
Just to ask someone, do you have enough time? What kind of time do you have? Do you have a couple minutes? Do you have 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Because I realized how helpful that is, because someone said, you know what, I'm so glad you asked me, because I'm on my lunch break at work and I only have about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Things like that. So that's just plain courtesy.
Yeah.
We can talk a little bit more. We got more stuff to talk about when it comes to boundaries in just a moment. Let me give you the phone number for Soft Rose Recovery, because this is where Jackie and Erin are visiting us from. It's a beautiful place in Jacksonville where you can go if you have any questions about recovery or addiction. And that includes codependency and boundaries, which is what we're talking about today. The phone number is 904-439-4805. Again, 904-439-4805. So back to boundaries. I know we have a lot more to talk about, because we're talking about maybe finding that balance to get to the healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
And how do we do that?
I mean, we were talking about checking in with people, and really, for those of you who missed the beginning part, but we're talking about another way of saying it is, not trauma dumping on people or negative dumping on people. I know I sometimes need to get out my negative stuff, but as long as I'm checking in with and saying, hey, do you have a few minutes? I need to just be really negative for a second. I just need to vent. It allows the other person to kind of prepare themselves to sort of say, okay, cool. Like, I'm strapping on that armor, so to speak, ready to listen. And two, it allows me, if the other person, if I start to do that and they're not ready and they shut me off, I'm not in the middle of oh my gosh, I'm having all this stuff and now I've partially released it, but I have to suck it back in, that can be more painful. So boundaries are really just communicating our needs, checking in with the other person. You know, even if it's something that's, if we accidentally cross a boundary, which is going to happen, you know, it's not about it being perfect, but it's about being like, oh, let's say I'm like, I just dumped all this stuff at you and I'm frustrated and I'm stressed and I'm overwhelmed, and the other person's like, whoa, what just happened? Got hit by a tidal wave. It's also okay to say like, okay, hold on, I need a moment to like, you know, check in with this right now. Like I'm really struggling to receive. So that is also a boundary from the receiver of saying, I need a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's boundaries are huge, to be assertive, to be calm, to be firm, to be respectful. You know, that's something that, yes, we want to check in as much as we can. We want to kind of do a temperature check ahead of times. But if that doesn't happen, and if someone crosses our boundary, intentional or unintentional, it's just about reiterating it and checking in and letting the other person know where we're at.
And it's also, yeah, Erin said all that really beautifully, being receptive to the feedback as well, because people are gonna have reactions and responses to the no's and to the boundaries that you implement. I think oftentimes initially communicating and expressing a boundary can feel relatively simple. What gets complex is the maintenance of it. So being able to show up and say, you know, and maintain the boundary. So the maintenance of the boundaries can get really difficult, especially if we are getting pushback or are getting reactivity or are getting this negative feedback regarding it. So it's being willing to have the conversation and to understand what is evoking this reaction, what is happening for you that is evoking maybe this anger when I'm saying no, and it's holding space while also sticking to that and seeing that as something that is important and valuable to you and your parameters and what you feel comfortable with, while also engaging in some level of conversation regarding the other person and what the response may be to it.
I'm sure you work with plenty of people. When I first discovered that I could set boundaries,
yeah,
it was a beautiful thing, right? But not everybody pays attention to my boundaries.
Yeah.
I want them to respect all of my boundaries to the T, but that doesn't always happen, as we know. And I'm sure you have folks that you work with at Sophros that, you know, start setting these boundaries finally in their life, and then all of a sudden, wait a minute, not everybody's following the rules here.
Yeah.
So what do you do if that happens? And, you know, there's some serious boundaries you need to set with people. What happens when they're not respecting that?
So it's always circling back and having conversations. Communication is one of the most important and underused tools that we have within our lives, in terms of our body language, in terms of our tone of voice, in terms of even just verbal words that we say and use. And we can say so much to somebody in a way that they can receive it. And unfortunately, we aren't told those and taught those skills. So what is effective communication? And that's a whole separate conversation in and of itself. But it's coming to that person who's not respecting your boundary and having a conversation about it, and being able to engage in telling them how it's making you feel, that it's not being respected or acknowledged, and then asking what are the barriers. You know, I communicated and expressed to you that X thing makes me feel uncomfortable, yet I feel like there isn't a follow through on respecting that. And so what's really getting in the way for you? Am I not being clear enough? And again, it's kind of approaching the conversation with some level of like gentleness, if you will, and not aggression, but saying like, this is creating now, you know, a problem or an issue for me. So what can we do to come together and talk about what is difficult for you to respect it, and why this is still important for me to discuss and maintain in terms of my boundary and limitations.
And when do you know that you have to, I mean, there's got to be a point at some point when someone just keeps pushing back and doesn't respect your boundaries, that you probably need to either step away from that, cut them off. I mean, is there a point when you do that?
So one of my favorite things to tell people is a boundary without a consequence is not truly a boundary. The consequence can vary, but I mean, there's also natural consequences. If we go back to, you know, the animals in a fence inside of a road, if the animal gets out, a consequence might be it gets hit by a car. It might be that it runs away and doesn't find its home, you know, or the consequence might just be changing the fence, you know, or reestablishing, you know, clearer, more defined boundaries. So it doesn't, I know that's a pretty harsh one, but sometimes they're natural. Other times they are, it's not necessarily punitive, but it's like, hey, if I'm asking you, I'm going to go back to this one because it's easy, because a lot of them are emotional ones, I think, get a little bit more complex. So I think it's always, because we don't see our emotions. We don't see our thoughts. We can see something physical. So sometimes I like to use physical examples with any emotional thing and then sort of translate that to emotional. But let's go to the hugging one. You know, if I'm asking someone repeatedly, hey, I'm not comfortable with hugging, or please ask me before you hug, and they're just coming up and grabbing me and all of that, you know, yes, I will establish the boundary. I might even reiterate the boundary. If you've crossed my boundary, you know, 2, 3, sometimes hundreds of times, but honestly, even if you've crossed it 2 or 3 times, you're choosing to not respect me. You're choosing, and it might not be malicious.
Right.
That is the thing. Intentions might be good. It does not negate the impact. And the impact is, I am hurt, I am uncomfortable, and I am disrespected. You could have intentions that are, but I just love you and I care about you, and that's wonderful and beautiful and so special, and I'm still hurt. So at that point, maybe it's, I'm spending less time with you. Maybe it's, as soon as I see you show up, I'm putting my hands up and stepping back. That might feel jarring to be like, whoa, why are you putting your hands up to me? It's like, I'm doing that because you have continuously said, I am not valuing your no. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. That doesn't mean that your intentions are bad, but it means I have to now do extra things to protect myself.
And that was the thing I was going to touch on too, is this feeling of, I no longer feel safe.
Yes.
I no longer feel safe within this space. And so that's going to create, like Erin had mentioned, some level of consequence. And I think that then that's going to create maybe deeper strain or deeper conflict within that relationship.
Yeah.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground when it comes to boundaries, and I think those are all really interesting ways to figure out, okay, if you're listening, I'm sure one of those resonated with you on some things you may need to have a conversation about with certain people in your life. So when we get back, we're going to talk about, why is it so hard to establish those kind of boundaries? You probably have an idea already, but we're going to talk to the experts about it, Jackie and Erin, when we come back. With therapist Jackie Ivey and the clinical director at Soft Roast Recovery, Erin Moran. And we're talking about boundaries and codependency. And right before the break, I said we're going to talk about, why is it so hard to establish these boundaries? We've been talking a lot about relationships and how we have to have those conversations with people, but why is it so hard?
I think if we go back to how sort of this hour started, is, because a lot of us have learned from a young age that it's important to, I don't know, sometimes maybe check in with other people, or to, whether intentional or not, but to not be as connected with our own needs. And so to start to set boundaries, you know, for some of us, we maybe grew up in a family that was not really clear boundaries, or sometimes even in school, it's like you're taught to not even listen to, sometimes, oh, I have to use the restroom. Like, well, I don't know. Is it the right time? How many times have I gone? And you know, it's like all of these little different things. So it's building a skill of learning to slow down and reconnect with yourself. There's also oftentimes a lot of fear of how other people might respond. It could be a fear of, okay, well, if I communicate with my loved one, friend, family, coworker, whomever, what if they get angry with me? You know, what if they set a consequence to my consequence? What if the relationship ends? You know, that there's fear associated to what could happen.
Yeah, those kind of conversations are hard. I mean, when I try to have conversations like that with my dad, for example, he's 80, Vietnam vet, you know,
Mm.
he's like, oh, you know, he doesn't like to talk about emotional things.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, he's not the only one. So I can see how those could be hard. I don't know if you had something to add to that, because I wanted to add a question for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, we've focused a lot on the communication of boundaries within relationships. I also think it's important to mention that boundaries are used with just within our day-to-day lives. So these can be time boundaries, work boundaries. I know work boundaries for me personally were really tough at first, and luckily I have, you know, a great supervisor and a great boss who prioritize self-care and who prioritize taking time off. When I initially started, you know, I was doing notes at home, and I was just very, very porous within my work boundaries, and I wasn't really taking time off during the month or the year. And, you know, luckily with guidance of like, hey, this is going to result in burnout, we really feel like it's important that, you know, when you're done at 5, you go home and you take that time for yourself and your other things within your life. And I was really supported in that area. And I think that I grew up with this mindset of productivity and what that looks like, and, you know, working all hours and putting all my time and energy into my work. And I think that I really had to learn. It wasn't until my adult life that I learned, wow, me taking care of me saying at 5 o'clock I'm done, me taking a 1 or 2 days a month off to engage in self-care. That's me prioritizing me to best do my job.
Correct.
Because without doing that, I'm going to be very stressed, and I'm going to then start to neglect my self-care, which is then going to impact my ability to work and function to an optimal, you know, what's the word I'm looking for?
Productivity.
Yeah, like an
Level.
optimal level. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think that it's really important to look at boundaries within your relationships, yes, but also just boundaries within your life as a whole. And an analogy I like to use as well is thinking of your life as a pie. And what does your pie chart look like? So do I have 8 pieces of pie, or do I have 2 or 3? And if I only have 2 or 3, so if it's just work, family, and community, okay, like those 3 things are wonderful, that's great. I also may need to start incorporating and doing other things so that I have, and this is kind of maybe not wrapping into boundaries as much, but it kind of is, but just having more of a balance. And I think that having appropriate and healthy boundaries helps result in having balance.
Well, that's a benefit of the boundaries, right?
Yeah.
The work-life balance is exactly what I was going to ask you about, because we had talked so much about relationships, but yes, there are different types of boundaries, which is, you know, boundaries of your time, boundaries of drawing that line of, you know, I'm not going to work when I'm at home, those sort of things. So let me give the phone number real quick for Soft Roast Recovery here in Jacksonville. That number is 904-439-4805. Again, 904-439-4805. And you can always go to softroastrecovery.com and check it out there, and see if you have any questions, and anything you have to ask about addiction or recovery, they can help you out. So we're talking today about codependency and boundaries. And so let's talk more about the benefits of all of this, right? Like, we do the hard work. We make sure that we set the boundaries with the people in our lives that need to hear that from us. We set them with ourselves. So then we did talk a little bit about work-life balance, but are there other benefits to, you know, making sure that we're controlling these things?
Yeah, so the benefits, there's many of them. And I think that, just to name a couple, this is going to really improve your emotional health. So, excuse me, your ability to regulate and to feel rested and to feel stabilized within that realm. This is also going to overall just improve your relationships with other people. It's setting clear expectations and having a clear awareness as to what those expectations are. So a good place to start, if you're like, well, how do I even start setting boundaries? It's checking in and saying, okay, do I feel most of the time, either when I'm around this person or doing this thing, do I feel more drained or do I feel more energized? And a good way to check in, even just with like the physical body, is if you're feeling more drained, if you're feeling more depleted, if you're feeling more lower vibrational, then that may be a little signaling that, okay, I think I need to start implementing and communicating more of my needs and more boundaries. Whereas if I'm feeling well rested and stable and energized, then that may be a sign of, wow, I have some pretty, healthy parameters of my functioning, and I'm really sticking to those things, right? So a big thing for me is if I start to feel unstable or not rested, that means that's my body telling me, Jackie, you need to check in with yourself and see where you may be not drawing light or attention to, in which you may be needing. And I think that very much wraps into, okay, maybe I overworked a little bit that day, or maybe I took that one extra phone call when I really maybe didn't have the capacity to. So it's checking in with yourself after. And again, this is all about trial and error, and it's okay. Nothing is going to be perfect. Nothing is meant to be perfect. And this is a process of working with yourself and really fine-tuning that self-awareness to figure out where am I, and where could I just promote more, or where could I keep the same, or what do I maybe even need to be doing less of.
Yeah, I know a benefit for me when I follow my boundaries, especially the time consistency at work and not taking that work home. That's taken a long time for me to figure that out. I work in the news business, and so we don't understand that sometimes, but it also is something that, certain stories stick with you, so that's kind of unavoidable. But I have a benefit of having a huge sense of accomplishment once I actually started following those time boundaries for myself, because I realized how much it really does benefit me overall, just my overall well-being. So I'm sure there's more that you hear about that at Sophros, Erin, when you're working with people and they finally start sticking to it.
Well, that's what, at the end of it, there are countless benefits to having healthy, clearly communicated boundaries, but the root of it is going to be an ingredient that is necessary in order for you to live a healthy life. You will not have your mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health and well-being taken care of if there are not clearly defined boundaries, if you are not checking in with yourself and communicating that with others. It's essential.
When it comes to addiction, I mean, we know that there have to be really clear boundaries in certain arenas of your life, right?
Yep.
For example, maybe we had talked last week about, not going to certain places.
Yes.
Would be maybe an example of a boundary of not going to a bar if you thought that might tempt you to drink.
Yep.
So, have people come back to you and said, I'm really glad that I did that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that we hear all the time is, we're looking with clients to figure out, hey, where are the porous boundaries, or where are the too rigid boundaries, and how can we adjust? And the people who come back who are willing to take a look and willing to also do the hard stuff, because this is different and this is new. To develop that clear fence is uncomfortable. But when we do that and we're like, wow, I, was able to communicate with my family and they actually were receptive, or I didn't go to this event and I stayed sober and I came back on Monday and I feel so proud of myself. Like those are the moments that we want to continue to build, because it's going to develop self-esteem. It's going to develop safety. It's going to motivate you.
Yeah, we got to wrap it up. Yeah. So I like the fence, not the wall.
Yeah.
Which is what you talked about.
Yeah,
Jackie.
fence, not the wall. Yeah.
Good way to end it. So just remember it that way. If all this, it's all of it to sink in, but I'm sure something resonated with you and you're sitting there listening and you have questions still for Erin or Jackie, you can always give them a call at Sophros Recovery. That phone number is 904-439-4805. Great talk, ladies, as always. And thank you.